morning. I'm Denise Gross, the director of the Hardberger Park Conservancy, and I am here in the Wildscape demonstration garden at Hardberger Park with Patsy Kuntz, master naturalist, and also Judy Green, an urban biologist with Texas Parks and Wildlife. And they are going to be giving you a tour of the demonstration garden and the Wildscape is, and then also giving you tips on how to create a wildscape at your own home. So, Patsy.
Hi, I'm Patsy Kuntz, and I am with. I am Patsy Kuntz, and I am with the Alamo area chapter of the Master Naturalist here in San Antonio. And I'll be talking a little bit more about the Master Naturalist as we go into some of the history of the park in a few minutes. But our first speaker of the day is going to be Judy Green from Texas Parks and Wildlife. So there you go.
Hi, I'm Judy Green. I work for Texas Parks and Wildlife. I'm an urban wildlife biologist here in San Antonio, and I've been working with the agency for the past 26 years. And I'm going to be talking to you about creating a wildscape today. And as you're able to see, there are a lot of beautiful flowers in our garden this time of year. And most of you watching probably are avid gardeners yourself, or maybe you're wannabe gardeners. So the beauty of all this is that it's the #1 hobby in the nation. But what most people probably don't realize is that when you're gardening, you're actually doing positive things for our environment. It can be crucial for what you do in your urban landscape, in your backyard, front yard. Putting in a pollinator garden is an amazing thing. And it, again, restores a lot of the habitat that was destroyed during urbanization or when our cities were built. And as they continued, as well as across the nation, what we do as residents is a very powerful thing in our gardens. So I'd like to definitely encourage you to put a pollinator garden, a hummingbird garden, butterfly garden in your backyard, potentially. What most people don't realize also is that the landscape that you see around us, all of this beautiful, the trees, the shrubs, the wildflowers that we see and witness in our neighborhoods, in our cities, in the different states where we live or that we visit, those landscapes are provided because of the pollinators that we have. And they desperately need our help because they are on the decline because of all the cities that we're building. We're destroying a lot of their natural habitat. And so most of you may not also realize that about 85% of our flowering plants worldwide require pollinators in order for them to propagate themselves. So just as an added bonus, I want you to remember too that the oxygen that we breathe are thanks to all of the plants that surround us. So we definitely need oxygen. We definitely need our pollinators to ensure that we have that available to us in the future. And if you like to eat like I do, then also about 87% of our pollinators also help to cultivate a lot of our crops. So again, a very important thing to remember that you can have a huge positive impact on our environment by just putting something as simple as a pollinator garden onto your property. And it doesn't matter if it's really, really small, or if you're a large landowner, you can do the same thing as well on some large acreage by sowing some seed of some different wildflowers and putting in shrubs and trees, or allowing those to grow on your property and not removing them. So today we're here at the Hardberger Park beautiful demonstration garden. It's actually a wildscape demonstration garden that was put in by our Alamo area master naturalists here in San Antonio. The first garden was put in back in 1998 by Class 1 and Class 2. If any of y'all are watching, please shout out to us because we'd love to hear from you. But our current garden volunteers have put in this beautiful garden over the past year and a half. And a wildscape garden really is nothing more than a landscape that provides food, shelter, and nesting opportunities, or an opportunity to raise young in an area. So again, if you're putting in native plants, and that's one thing I definitely want to emphasize today, is that we really would like to have you incorporate a lot of these beautiful native plants, especially plants to your region, I should emphasize, because if you're coming in from a different state, you want to make sure that you check with your local agency and native plant societies to ensure that you're putting in the correct plants for your area. But putting in plants provides the three basics that I just mentioned. Again, food, shelter, and also nursing or
raising young opportunities. And then you add that last component, water, which really kind of rounds it out. So you have the basics of what wildlife need to survive, and they don't have to travel far if they can get everything in your backyard. If you can provide that through a bird bath. Here at the demonstration garden, we don't have a water source on site, but we do have a water source not far from us over at the Urban Ecology Center here at Phil Hardberger Park. So again, and we also, I don't know if y'all are going to be listening, but I hope you're listening, but if you can, try and listen for some of the hummingbirds that are swooping around, because you can hear them with their wing beats. You'll hear zzz, a little noise like that. But again, so we're trying to provide food, shelter, nesting opportunities. Well, the one thing that I usually tell people is to keep it as simple as possible. And most people aren't even really aware of the types of plants that may be native to their area. So the first quest I tell most people is to go to a local nursery that carries native plants. And then oftentimes there you can find them. They're typically labeled if it's a good nursery, and you can find out which ones are good hummingbird plants or butterfly plants, songbird plants, and then incorporate those in your garden. And focus on how the plants look and appeal to you, because typically if it's a blooming plant like you see here, like our firewheel, which is this one right here, it of course is a great nectaring plant for a lot of butterflies. It has a beautiful cone-like structure on the top, and butterflies like to actually land on that as a platform, and then they'll take their long tongue or proboscis and stick it down into that wonderful nectaring area in the center. And then, of course, drink that, and that's their food source as an adult butterfly. And we also have some horse mint over here, which is another one of my favorites, another great nectaring plant. And occasionally hummingbirds will visit this one, but again, it also serves as a great food source for our butterflies. So as a new gardener, if you're not familiar with what to put in, focus on, number one, putting in native plants, and then number two, making sure that you're focusing on whether or not it is a food source for wildlife that you're wanting to draw into your garden. For instance, if it's blooming and or fruiting. And fruiting means that it can be some type of seed, it can be an acorn, which is a mast, or it can be something like an actual berry, which is a fruit-like structure. So all those are food sources, and they vary, of course, depending on the plant. So the more diversity you have in your garden, then ultimately the more wildlife you can have in your garden. So that's a key point to make sure that you try to focus on. And then having something blooming or fruiting throughout the different seasons. And summer is oftentimes a hard time to find blooming items or blooming plants. So you might have to work a little bit harder to find some of those plants for your area. But again, that is a crucial time frame when a lot of our pollinators really don't have a lot to choose from. Spring, as you can see, is just in abundance here in this garden. But ultimately, we want to have more things pollinating throughout the year and available to our pollinators and to our songbirds. And the cool thing is remember, pollinators are, like I said earlier, so important. And we want to help our pollinators. And guess what? If you like birds, maybe you're not into bees, but I will tell you one fact a little bit later. But ultimately, birds love to feed on insects, and it's very important during this springtime when they're raising their young that's a major food source for a lot of our birds, lizards, as well as other reptiles, and toads, of course, love to eat insects too. So all that has to be present. Let's see, let's take a look around here. I am going to mention just a few shrubs, because when you're creating a demonstration garden, you do want to have layering. You don't want to have only low-growing plants. You would like to try to incorporate some plants that also have some different heights throughout your garden. Over here, it was just put in last year, so it hasn't grown to its full mature size yet, but that's Mexican buckeye, and that will produce a beautiful mass that a lot of our mammals will like to enjoy eating. And then, of course, it puts out a beautiful bloom that hummingbirds and butterflies will enjoy. And then we do have Lindheimer muley, which is a native grass, and it's very symmetrical. And I like it just because of the fact that it adds a really nice accent to the garden, and it brings in a lot of birds because they use it for nesting material, but they also eat the seeds off of this plant, and it is also a larval host plant. So keep that in mind if you're trying to attract butterflies to your garden, which many of us like to do. The thing to remember is you have to have larval host plants for them as well. Some of our butterflies really need a certain type of plant to lay their eggs on, whereas other butterflies sometimes will lay their eggs on any kind of plant. It doesn't really matter for some of them, but some of them are very specific to a particular type of plant. So knowing the larval host plants of the butterflies you're trying to draw in is kind of important. Over here is a beautiful shrub, which is called rock rose. It's got a beautiful pink bloom on it. Let me come over here so you can point to it. It's actually a biennial. The mother plant will typically throw out a lot of seed, and you'll have a lot of babies coming up around this particular plant. And it is important to keep those babies intact because the mother plant oftentimes will die after about 4 years. So you want the babies to replace it. And before I move it over to Patsy, I wanted to also mention that a lot of these wildflowers that we're seeing here in the garden, they weren't this prominent last year. But what we did was we allowed our wildflowers to actually go to seed. And after they bloom, they of course start to look very unappealing for most gardeners because they start to die. But don't mow or cut back those wildflowers right away. You do want them to throw out their seed, and sometimes it can take a couple of weeks for them to do that task. And that way it'll ensure that you have more seed in the future, and it'll just replenish itself in your garden if that's what you're wanting, especially if you're trying to create a wildflower meadow like what we're seeing here. Patsy, would you like to, actually, you know what? While we make our way over to Patsy, I'd like to showcase a few more plants, especially for butterflies. This one right here, let's see, this one's not quite blooming yet, but we do have some. Where is our mist flower? This is the Greg's mist flower right here. There's a tiny little flower coming in right here. These will be beautiful little blue blooms, kind of lavender blooms. This one, it just drives butterflies crazy. It's probably one of my must-have plants in any garden if you're wanting to incorporate butterflies, for the very reason that they almost seem like they're just they just are all over it. I mean, and you'll have hundreds of butterflies on this thing. I actually planted this in my yard out front in a cul-de-sac, a drive-by area, and cars would drive by, and because the butterflies were actually nectaring when they would drive by, the wind from the car would uplift them, and then all of a sudden you'd have hundreds of butterflies literally just floating above my mist flower, and then the cars would stop and go in reverse. And so then they were of course coming back to take a look at what was going on, all this action that was happening at my Greg's mist flower. The downside was I was always concerned when I would see them that, you know, somebody was going to get rear-ended or something. So I was like, maybe not the best place to have the mist flower right next to the road. But again, it's a wonderful plant. We'll draw in a ton of butterflies. So Patsy, let me, yes.
One question before we go to Patsy. Someone wants to know the name again of the tall purple flower there in the back.
That is horse mint or bee balm. It has two common names. And I'm glad you mentioned that. When you're looking at plants to incorporate in your garden, it's very important to make sure, if you can, when you're looking, especially through books, to write down the scientific name if you can. Because this plant has two common names. And sometimes the plant will share a common name with with one other, sometimes as many as 5 other different plants. And so ultimately, if you're not writing down the scientific name, you go to the local nursery or you go to a plant sale, and somebody says, oh, yes, this is bee balm. And you're like, oh, I remember seeing that at the garden. I want that one. You take it home, you put it in the ground, and then the next thing you know, it's like 6 feet tall. It looks nothing like what you saw at the garden. And now you're like wondering, what did I actually buy? So having that scientific name is really, really important. So tack it on if you're writing a list, and you can use resource books. I did bring some field guides, and I do have a book that I'll be mentioning here in just a minute that also has some really good, valuable information. In addition to most field guides will also list the common name as well as the scientific name. And Patsy, I'll go ahead and roll it over to you.
Okay. All right. Well, delighted to be here today. This is one of my favorite places in the world. So, and great company today. I will tell you that mist flower that you were looking at is actually in bloom right over there while we still have it. Can you do that, Teresa?
The mist flower?
The mist flower, the little...
In the middle.
In the middle, the small, fuzzy-looking flowers. That's the mist flower we're talking about. And that mist flower will bloom like crazy. That's a small stand right there, but it's going to have 5 or 6 more blossoms, times the number of blossoms. And as Judith said, the butterflies absolutely love it. I can't say enough good stuff about this plant. In fact, Patty Leslie Pasteur, one of the most knowledgeable people about wildflowers in San Antonio, calls it butterfly crack. They just can't not go to. Once they found it, then that's what they have to eat. So one of my roles here today is to, before I forget, we do invite you to ask questions. And I can't remember whether Denise got that in or not, but we invite you also to tell us where you're watching from. Are you in San Antonio? Are you another place in Texas? Are you outside of Texas? So if you put that in the comments, we're kind of trying to keep track. I think Denise saw that we have like 16, a few minutes ago, we had 69 viewers. So we're just trying to figure out where people are watching from. My job right this moment, I think, is to tell you something about the garden itself, how it came to be. Judith mentioned that the second class of the Alamo Area Master Naturalist chapter started this garden as a class project. And if you're not familiar with Master Naturalists, maybe I should say a couple of words about that organization. It was 1997 into 1998, I believe, maybe mid-90s, where a group of people here in San Antonio who worked in the natural areas determined that it sure would be really nice to have a cadre of volunteers who had a lot of, substantial knowledge about natural stuff, the ecology of the area, to help do classes, tend gardens, do all kinds of things that there just were never going to be enough people, paid people, to do. And Judy Green was one of the people who came up with this concept for the Master Naturalist. So she's been a sponsor with our group for 20 some odd years now. To become a Master Naturalist, you need to take a class that has like 40 hours of classroom time and field trips. And then those folks need to do some volunteer time to become a certified, 40 hours actually, before they become a certified Master Naturalist. Before that, they can be called a Master Naturalist, but they're not a certified Master Naturalist. And there's an annual fee that we pay, not very much, to stay a certified member. And we have to do 8 hours of training through the course of the year, as well as 40 hours of service time, and those are the minimums. So the second class of the Master Naturalist, we have a question, just a second.
Oh, no, sorry, I was just going to tell you where people are watching from today. As far away as Clinton, Mississippi, Galveston, Texas, throughout San Antonio, from SeaWorld down to near downtown, here in the neighborhood, Kennedy, Texas, Helotes, Waxahachie, Weatherford, Texas, Arlington, Cedar Park, Austin, Dickinson. So, watching from California, because they're moving to San Antonio, Texas this fall. So,
great.
Welcome to you, Donald. So
yeah, that's
just a few.
I bet you I know who the Clinton, Mississippi person is too, and if that's Pam, thank you for joining us. I went to high school with her, and she's a naturalist in Clinton, Mississippi. So, so the garden, this garden, while the second Alamo Area Master Naturalist class was in progress, the city of San Antonio asked if the class would be interested in a class project creating a wildscape demonstration garden down in an area along the Riverwalk, which was a great idea. And the class took that project on. So a goodly number of people were involved in it. People took certain sections. One was the butterfly section, one was the hummingbird section, one was this, one was that. And they created a gorgeous little garden, not so little. It was the size of a city lot in downtown San Antonio. And it was near Cesar Chavez and the crossing of that over the river. And at that time, it wasn't called Cesar Chavez, it was called Durango. So the garden was actually at the corner of Old Gilbo and Aubrey. And for many, many years, a great number of people tended that garden. And it was quite a lovely spot, an unexpected gem in downtown San Antonio, because you see the high rises, you see the Riverwalk, and you see some nice plantings, many of which are not native to the area. And so here was this native area where when we were tending that garden, oftentimes visitors would come from other places in Texas and say, this is one of the places that I stop when I come every year. So, and as well as there were people who worked downtown who came and would have lunch in the garden to really sit back and enjoy the peace and quiet in that amazing little gym in the hustle and bustle of downtown San Antonio. Well, several years ago, I guess this is probably about 2017, we found out that one of the neighbors of the garden wanted to purchase the area that the garden was on. And that is when it came as a great surprise to us, but the property that we were on was actually owned by the San Antonio River Authority. And in the end, the San Antonio River Authority decided to sell that property, go ahead and sell that property to the neighbor. But there was a caveat, and that was that they had that buyer had to pay a certain amount of money over and above the appraised value of the property so that we could be given that money to create a new garden somewhere else. And the buyer did pay that money. So we had a chunk of money that we asked for. We gave them a figure. We started a process then. Judith helped us with it a lot. Evelyn Penrod is the chair of the garden committee. And she and I and Judith began trying to figure out where we would put another one. And San Antonio River Authority offered us several pieces of property, but none of them did all of the things that we were looking for. One of the things that was really important to us was heavy visitation. We figured that if we had a demonstration garden, we wanted people there so we could demonstrate too. So we were looking for high visitation. Long story short, we ended up here in Hardberger Park. We wanted to be here. It's a relatively new park in the San Antonio system. People were just finding it and getting used to it, and they wanted us. And they saw, the folks, the San Antonio Parks and Rec, the Phil Hardberger Park Conservancy, saw what a good fit this garden could be for this park. So we are here. And we started looking for someone to help us create the garden, to do the hardscaping, to do the raised beds, to do the fencing. And I don't know if you've noticed the fencing here, but that is quite an important feature. The contractor that we chose, Randy Rogers of Blue Heron, helped us figure out that we could diminish the size, diminish the look of the fence if we did it in this rusty colored fencing. And it really does sort of blend into the landscape. It sort of sits below the tree line and blends into the green of the trees. It's an 8-foot fence, and we did that. The reason we needed a fence in this area was because this park has a lot of deer. And if there are many plants that are deer resistant, heavily deer resistant as a matter of fact, but many other plants that we wanted to grow and show that are not deer resistant. So we needed a way to keep the deer out of here. And we ended up, the gates, if we want to go over to the gates are only 6 feet tall because the metal gates became very heavy. And it was going to be really hard to get the right kind of hardware, etc., to be able to work those gates. So we ended up, and this was what Randy Rogers came up with, the cabling around the top of the fence area. We've got a double fence that also is to try to prevent, it's a second way to prevent deer from getting in here. If they get in one fence, they probably can't get in the other fence. But cabling around the top of it is at 8 feet, just about 8 feet. So the idea there is that that's a deterrent to the deer for jumping the fence. And Randy came up with the idea of the 4 columns. They're cedar columns around that little entrance, and we have one similarly at the other side on the north end of the garden. We have vines now growing up, and eventually the vines will go across the cabling, and it will look as if that's more solid than it actually is. Interestingly, as I talk about plants, well, we have a question.
Someone is wondering what plants are good for hummingbirds.
Ah.
And I know you
We'll be-
one over here.
Yeah, we have a question about what plants are good for hummingbirds. We will be talking a little more about that. And I need to wrap it up. Oh, no, I'm getting a signal. Just tell me what you're saying.
I was just gonna say, so we can focus.
Oh, yeah, we want to get on the plants. Yeah. At any rate, we put this garden together and have been tending it now, as Judith said, for a year and a half. And it has, I would say, exceeded my expectations because it's prettier way earlier than we would have thought it would be this beautiful. And part of it is the wildflowers that have come in and that we appreciate so much. So let me see. We'll go over to the center, I call the Keyhole Garden. And over there is where we get a lot of hummingbirds. We've got a couple of hummingbird attractors. Teresa is focusing in on the yucca, and that is the yucca. It's called a red yucca. And interestingly, it's not red, and it's not really a yucca, but that's what it's called. It's part of the aloe family, as I understand it. But we have these beautiful blossoms that are sort of coral and yellow, and the hummingbirds love them. In fact, we were here maybe 5 minutes this morning when we started seeing hummingbirds coming to them. So if we're lucky, they may come. Now, they don't like it that we're standing close to them, but if we're 12 feet away, they are good with coming to it. So the red yucca is a wonderful hummingbird plant. And it's going to bloom now, probably into next month. You can see some of it is already going to seed. The seed pods are right here. And they're created, obviously, once the flowers are spent, and then you get your seed pods. So another of the plants, yes, that spike has several more seed pods on it now. Another of the plants in here that is a real hummingbird attractor is the autumn sage, Salvia gregii, I believe.
Yes.
And we have 2 different colors. We have we have 3 different colors. I would call this a hot pink, and then we have more of a red with a little salmon color in it, and then we have in the middle we have a white one. And I see the hummingbird at all of them, and they come and it's hard to get a good photo of a hummingbird. The hummingbirds that we have right now in this area are the black-chinned hummingbirds. And we have ruby-throated hummingbirds in the winter, but they have now gone north. The black-chinned are here, and they're kind of fun because they bob their tail like this. It's one of the easier ways to get a sense that it's a black-chinned hummingbird. We also do have other hummingbirds that come to San Antonio, but they more or less don't come in large numbers, and they often don't stay around very long. We are part of the Central Flyway, so we get a lot of birds through here and a lot of butterflies through here in the spring and in the fall. And they come up from the Gulf of Mexico, from Central America, or even South America. They come through this part of the country, and sometimes they come up right up I-35, just like you and I do when we get on the freeway. And they go north, sometimes pretty far north. So we've talked about a couple of the nicer hummingbird plants. Do you have any other questions that we could cover? I've got more plants to talk about.
I got a few she gave me.
Okay.
So I just wanted to also mention before we diverse from the Salvia gregii, you see the multiple colors that they offer, and there's a ton of them in the nursery. But the beautiful thing about this plant is if you, this is another one of my favorites because of the fact that it is almost a bloomer 9 months out of the year. So, and that's, it's a small, considered a small shrub, but it will get woody on you after about 2 to 3 years. So make sure you cut it back in the winter months, and then it'll produce more blooms. And if for some reason you forget to cut it back in winter, then don't hesitate to cut it back in mid-July. That's actually a really good time of year to cut back a lot of your plants, but don't cut them all the way to the ground. Always leave about a foot of the plant intact, or you can kind of pick and choose some of the more leggy looking type of woody parts of the plant to remove, and then therefore you'll get more blooms coming out. There was one question about local nurseries where you can find some of these plants. I do have a list of plants that Parks and Wildlife provides, so I can either get that to you if you want to contact our local office, Parks and Wildlife Urban Wildlife Office. However, I will mention a few here. If you're looking at doing a large area, then you can put in seed sources, or you can use seeds, which is a lot cheaper than buying the actual plants. And then you can get those seeds at a variety of nearby seed sources. At least this is for the San Antonio area. You'll have to check with, again, your local agency from your state if you're from out of state, or maybe with your native plant societies to find out where they acquire some of their local native plants. But Douglas King seed, Native American seed, Plants of the Southwest, Seeds of Change, and Wild Seed Farms are some of the ones that people get their seeds from around here. As far as nurseries, we have, let's see, Medina Garden Nursery, which is a little bit away from San Antonio, but they carry a lot of natives there, especially a lot of milkweeds for monarchs if you're looking for those. Milberger's Nursery, Natives of Texas, is in Kerrville, another great native nursery. Rainbow Gardens, too. They have multiple locations here in San Antonio, and then Shades of Green as well. So there are a few more others, but again, we want to make sure that if you are looking for plants, especially those in the way of natives, we want to make sure that you can find those and just ask around. That's another great way. Another question that we had was mentioning if you have a big area, how do you convert it into a garden? Well, that's actually a great question because a lot of people wind up digging up a lot of the area. They feel like if they have grass already on site, they have to remove that. And so ultimately, what we like to do is, especially here in with the demonstration garden, is we do something called smothering. So what you can do is we have laid down cardboard on top of existing plants or grass that was here previous to our arrival, and then we laid down about 4 to 6 inches of mulch, and we just let that kind of smother. The plants that are underneath that cardboard will ultimately just die out and provide some of the compost, if you will, beneath that cardboard. And the cardboard over time also will biodegrade. So really you have natural products that are biodegrading, and you wind up with some extra soil there, and the mulch helps keep the weed growth down. But you can also do something called solarization. That's another method, and that is just using something like a large clear tarp of some kind. You can use a painter's tarp, a clear one. That works best, and you can just spray an area with water, then lay down the clear plastic, put some rocks down on it, and do this typically during late spring, midsummer, when it gets really hot, and that will kill everything there in that location. And then you can, typically I've been told, sprinkle it with a little bit of water after you take off the plastic, see if things grow back for about a week or two, and if things are popping right back, then you haven't done it good enough. So then redo that whole process. And that ultimately kills any kind of grass or anything that you don't want growing there. So that's one method. So hopefully that's helpful. Another question that we had was about, before we go to that question, let's take a look at some of the plants again. Just because, again, one of the questions was, how do we create a beautiful garden for butterflies and hummingbirds? That's kind of the top pick for most homeowners. This is Skullcap, and a lot of people sometimes have shade, and I don't want you to think that, now this garden is in full sun, but you can get some really good plants for shade conditions too. This Skullcap, as you can see, has a beautiful, almost perfect mound, and it's almost perfectly round, and so it's a very showy piece.
the bloom itself is kind of tubular, so butterflies, of course, can get to the nectar within it, but hummingbirds love tubular flowers as well. Whereas if you compare the plant right next to it, which is Zexmenia, it is actually a more flat surface, and so this is really more conducive for our butterflies. And so both of these, of course, are good hummingbird and nectarine plants. And sometimes if you put one in, even though you're maybe putting in a hummingbird garden, you'll, of course, typically get a lot of butterflies as well. The one thing I wanted to mention about Skullcap is that it is also a very good shade plant. You won't get the blooms that you get in the sun, but it is an evergreen plant. And so sometimes people want to have something that's green year-round in their garden. And even though they're shady, it's in a shady area, you'll still have something green in that location wherever you place it. And then over here we have mealy blue sage, which is a beautiful blue plant. I'm going to kind of pop in here. And you can see this beautiful blue. As a matter of fact, I have a bee right here over by my hand. And I'm glad this little bee is visiting. He's not disturbing me. And that's something I also wanted to mention to our viewers is that bees are our #1 pollinator. They do a fantastic job of planting nectaring and collecting pollen, because that's what they feed on. That is what they're out doing every day. They're seeking pollen and nectar that they take back to their home base or to their hive. And most of our native bees, we have about 700 different species in the state of Texas, and 90% of our native bees are solitary bees. What does that mean? Well, that means that they don't defend their hives. They don't defend their eggs, where they lay their eggs. So ultimately, they are typically very docile. They don't sting. They can't afford to, because if they get killed, that means that stops the genetic process of that particular bee. They can't lay more eggs and have more babies. So again, they're very solitary. Most people are very fearful of our bees, but I think that comes from our non-native honeybees, because they do form large hives, and if that hive is disrupted, of course, then you can get into some trouble. But as you can see, I hope you're capturing that. There's a beautiful bumblebee flying over here. And bumblebees are one of the social. So they're in the 10% group. So they're actually a social group. So they have a hive of multiple bumblebees together. Whereas, again, 90% of our bees are solitary. So that's the beauty of having these pollinator gardens. And they are in dire need because their populations are on the decline. So we want to make sure we're helping them along by planting some beautiful plants that they can feed on, but also will enhance our landscapes and even beautify our homes.
Want me to do a few?
Yeah, Patsy,
Okay.
go ahead. Well,
Okay.
I'm going to pass it back to Patsy, and she can showcase some other flowers.
Yeah. I might make one more note about the Zexmenia. That also does well in part shade. And it will continue to bloom pretty prolifically in part shade. So both of these plants here are really good for part shade. Deep shade is another story, and we don't have a whole lot of plants out here that like deep shade. There are some, and Judith has a really nice list of shade-loving native plants that if you will put a comment in there, we can be sure to try, and with your email address, we can be sure to try to get that to you. Let's walk farther over this way.
While you're walking that way, Patsy, are there some plants you would recommend that are long blooming that might bloom through the summer?
Mm-hmm. Well, the autumn sage, as Judith said, is a very long bloomer, and one of the reasons that we like long bloomers is not just because we can get to enjoy them, but it's nice because they start blooming very early. In fact, some even bloom through the winter here in a mild winter. But they're very good for butterflies, the early butterflies coming through and the late butterflies coming through, because they're in bloom at times when other food sources for those butterflies might not be available. I wanted to go down this way just a little bit. You can see over here we have some last of our blue bonnets. They're going to seed. And it was just beautiful when they were in full bloom. And those seed pods now, when they get ripe, they're going to kind of twist and spin off and throw those seeds way far out oftentimes. So we love our bluebonnets here. One of the plants I wanted to show you right here is the Texas Dandelion. And I posted the picture of my of a photo. I posted a photo the other day of a Texas dandelion with a very small grasshopper on it, and one of my Facebook friends put a big frowny face. And I thought, why would that be? Well, first of all, she didn't like the grasshopper eating things. Grasshoppers have to eat too, as long as they don't come in and take your whole patch of edibles. If you're a farmer, that's a bad thing, but it's not going to do a lot of damage in an area like this. So I had a picture of a wonderful little half-inch long green grasshopper in a dandelion. These dandelions have more different kinds of bugs. Now, of course, I'm saying that and there's not a bug on them right now, but oftentimes there are a lot of bugs. And I see a little butterfly here. I don't know if you can get there or not, but there's a little bitty, whoop, there it goes. There's a little bitty butterfly. So he's fine. Oh, it's a pretty little butterfly. A lot of people don't like black and white butterflies just because they're not very colorful, but I think they're pretty spectacular. And these smaller butterflies are really, really fun. I don't happen to know the name of that one, but so the other thing that my friend did not like about the dandelion and grasshopper picture was that it was the name Dandelion. A lot of gardeners say dandelions, weeds, bad. Well, what's a weed to one person may not be a weed to another. These Texas dandelions don't tend to take over, and in a wildscape like this, they are a very valuable plant. So I would encourage you to love your dandelions, by golly. They don't deserve the bad rap that they get. Okay, we'll move over to the pink flowers right over here, the rock rose. It's a pavonia. I can't remember the Latin name, but pavonia is in there somewhere. This is the rock rose. Now this will get full, also very full of flowers, and it can use some shade too. It can't be in deep shade or it won't flower and it'll get kind of rangy, but it's a very nice plant in partial shade. I have some in my yard that are in partial shade and they do very well. And it's just started blooming, but it will bloom well into the fall. So it's a nice one that blooms late also. A lot of bees like it.
May I interject with the Blackfoot Daisy, which is this white bloom over here? That one is a spectacular one for Central Texas. It's very drought hardy, and that's something I didn't mention earlier, is that a lot of our native plants, especially native plants to your region, wherever it is that you live, if you're finding plants that were originally there, they do well with the amount of rainfall in your area. So ultimately, we want to make sure that we're incorporating native plants because they're drought hardy. They tend to be more disease resistant, so you don't have as many issues. They sometimes don't look as good in the pot when you're at a nursery and you're wanting to buy them, but once you plop them in the ground, boy, they take off in no time. And there is a critical time. There was a question about how long do I need to baby any plants that I put into the ground, and I would typically say about a month is what I would say. Of course, we want to avoid the summertime frame, and when you're putting in plants, if you can, plant in the spring. Fall is another great time. Most people don't think about planting in October, but that's a wonderful time to plant. That's also when typically you should be sowing any seed for larger areas or even smaller areas. If you want to do a little wet meadow in your backyard, you can definitely sow in the fall. And then also trees and shrubs. That's typically another time frame in the fall when you should be putting them in the ground. So they have time to root. And then of course, come spring, a lot of times you will already have a showcasing. I am holding this one book here for a reason because I want you to see it. It's called Native Texas Plants by Sally Wasowski. And if you live in Texas, then this is like the go-to book. It has all the different ecological regions or habitat types throughout our state. And then in addition, it also highlights all the beautiful plants that we see here. There is a map at the very front and they are numbered, so it's very easy to use. You kind of do a catalog shop, you flip through, you see all these beautiful plants. I like this one right here, which happens to be Esperanza. And if I look down under range, it's number 7. And even though this one says Transpecus, which is over in West Texas, this is one plant that is not necessarily native to San Antonio, but it does very well here. So you can have some plants that will adapt to your region. But there are a lot of other ones in here that, for instance, if I'm ecoregion number 8, I just look for the number 8, and then I know that plant will do really well for my area.
May I say something
Yes.
more? One more thing. I hate to keep going back and forth. Our camera operator here is doing a great job. The Blackfoot daisy, when we talk about babying new plants, I tried to baby Blackfoot daisy 3 times and it died every time. Blackfoot daisy does not like to be wet. And I planted it. The last time I finally figured out how to do this, you plant it, you put water on it so you're sure that all that soil is compacted down around it and you don't touch it again. And it does beautifully. If it gets really, 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 really dry, the blooms will die out. But the minute you get rain, within an hour or 2, this thing is starting to bud out again. So it's a really fun plant to have. And it gets a lot of small butterflies on it. Beautiful, beautiful. And some bees are very attracted to it also. It's one of my favorite plants now that I've figured out how to make it grow. So do you want to talk about the Zyzotes?
I do.
Oh, okay, good.
So if you love monarchs, then this plant right here, let me kind of make my way over here. This plant right here is called Zezotes, and it's a type of milkweed. And like I mentioned earlier, some butterflies are very specific to a particular plant. The females will only lay their eggs on a particular type of plant for their young to feed on. And plants in the milkweed family, this is actually the bloom right here. It's really not very showy. I mean, it kind of blends in with the leaf color, but it's a beautiful flower if you really zoom in on that. I know you may not be able to, but I mean, if you're looking at the plant on your property, you can definitely see how gorgeous it is. But ultimately, our monarchs are now coming from Mexico. They've overwintered in Mexico, and the longest lived generation of monarchs have made their way up to Texas. So they will be laying their eggs here in Texas this spring as they're migrating northbound to as far north as Canada. And so they will lay their eggs, and unfortunately after they lay their eggs, they die. So the young won't ever get a chance to really meet their parents, but they then make that continuous journey northbound. The first generation that comes out here in Texas lives about a month, continues northbound, lays its eggs, and then it dies. Again, that takes about 2 to 3 generations to make it as far north as Canada. And then the 4th generation lives the longest, and it does that journey all the way from far north of the United States down to Mexico and overwinters in Mexico. So in springtime, it is crucial to have a lot of wonderful nectaring plants for our monarchs as they make that journey northbound, because they have to feed on that nectar to be able to do all this. And so ultimately, they are also in need of having native milkweed plants, native to your area. And there is an online Texas milkweed, or the Milkweeds of Texas, or Texas milkweeds. If you Google it, you should be able to get the online PDF, and it highlights all the different species of milkweed we have here in Texas. So you can actually look for this plant if you have some land. If you're a landowner, even if it's 5 acres, you may even have it if you are in the city and you have a little bit of green space that was left intact during development. So you can look for these plants. But we planted this one, and it's, again, it provides a larval host plant for the caterpillars. They will devour these plants. Just know that. When you're putting in larval host plants, these caterpillars will eat your leaves. They will eat the whole plant. But the beauty is, like with most wildflowers or native plants, is they come back in no time, whether they're being fed on deer or larvae from butterflies or rabbits. Again, most plants respond immediately with putting on new growth. So don't worry too much if your plant gets eaten down. It usually will come right back.
Judith, can you repeat the name of that milkweed?
Yes, it is Zezotes, and it's spelled Zizotes. Zezotes is the common name. And then just real quick, this there's actually some beautiful pollinators on this fall sneezeweed. Now this is something we didn't plant. It was a volunteer, and that's why it is important to have a good field guide. And I like Marshall Enquist's Wildflowers of Texas, if you're in the Texas, central Texas area, as a field guide to identify some of your wildflowers that you may have coming up on their own. And
may I interject just a second? When you're talking about identifying plants, there's a relatively new software out, organization called iNaturalist. And I'm just getting used to it myself, but it is a great way to help with plant IDs. You can, once you've got it installed in your phone, you can take a photo of plants or animals or whatever, and it will oftentimes give you some idea as to what that plant is. So it's a real help when trying to figure these things out. There's also, I think it's called Wildflowers. There's a Facebook page called Wildflowers of Texas, I believe.
Wildflowers.org.
Okay.
That is the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Research Center database.
Well, that's right.
Let me just interject real quick.
That's a good one. That's a good one. I'm talking about something else.
Okay, but
yeah.
that's a good one. Only because I mentioned that one because not only do they have plant lists for the state of Texas, but they also have plant lists for every state in the United States. So if, regardless of where you're from, they have great plant lists, and they have different kinds of plant lists. So definitely check out the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. And what were you mentioning, Patty?
I was just going to say that's my go-to place.
Database.
I have been using that database for at least a decade now, and that gives you the most information that anybody does about a given plant.
Native plants.
Native plants.
Yeah,
it has to be native plants.
Yes.
If it's not a native, they don't know about it. I mean, they don't have it. So I want to talk two things. I've been seeing we only have a few more minutes left. I've been seeing our mockingbird that hangs around here up in the tree over there. And a few weeks ago, I saw mockingbirds bringing nesting material into this cedar elm. We haven't talked a lot about the trees here, but I did just want to mention this cedar elm is a fabulous tree. And I can't find the nest in there, so I think they must have nested someplace else, but they surely examined that tree carefully as a place to nest. It's a wonderful place for birds to nest. And I'm going to go back around here. But I thought of a plant that we have that's really, really good for the shade. We want to come back and talk about frog fruit. We have a cedar sage over here. And it's a wonderful little plant. They'll get bigger. These are a little on the small end, but we still have a few blossoms left. The next one to your left, Teresa, it still has some leaves on it. Yeah, there you go. That's a wonderful plant, and it can handle pretty deep shade. It actually doesn't like sun. It's part sun to heavy shade. And it will bloom and bloom and bloom. When it starts to get dry, like it's getting drier here in San Antonio right now, we haven't had rain in this location in some time, it will kind of die back. And the leaves get brown and you think, oh no, I lost my plant. And then the first rain, it greens up almost immediately and then starts setting buds again. It's an incredible plant. It's a very fun plant. Not a lot of people use it. Maybe in part because it kind of looks deadish if it gets real dry, but you can throw some water on it if it's close enough to your house and you really want to see some nice green and flowers. So that's a good native, and deep shade works for it.
I just wanted to point out a few more shade-loving plants. This frog fruit right here, it actually is a wonderful nectaring plant for very small butterflies. You'll see a lot of little blues on it a lot. And it is very, very drought hardy. And as you can see, is a nice little ground spreading type of plant. So it can kind of cover an area. And like I said, it does work well in shade. Typically, most of your shade plants just won't have as many blooms if you have them in deep, deep shade. But the nice thing is they green up your area. Another beautiful shade-loving plant is Salvia coccinea. And it's scarlet sage is the common name. And here's a red one, here's a white one. Typically, hummingbirds love the red blooms much more than they do the white ones. But they'll visit a lot of them, but they're drawn to red. So remember that when you're picking your colors. But that one is a wildflower. So it actually needs to go to seed. The nice thing about that thing is you can, if you have an area that you just can't grow anything under a tree, try getting the Salvia coccinea seed and throw it out underneath that plant or that area that is very shady, and just water it in and see what you get, because a lot of times it tolerates horrible soils and a lot of deep shade. But remember, if it's really, really shady, nothing grows in areas that receive no sunlight. And then one other one I wanted to highlight is this inland ceos, which is a grass, and it has a beautiful kind of fall color. It's kind of browns in the fall, and with the seed pods dangling off of it, if you leave it intact, it will be beautiful during the winter months and add kind of a nice accent to your garden.
Judy, Turk's Cap is back there,
yes,
right behind you. If you want to, it's not blooming yet, but that's another good shade plant.
And that one, we have some growing on the outside, but this one, I don't know if it's a volunteer, but anyway, Turk's Cap is yet another great shade-loving plant. It has a beautiful red bloom that attracts hummingbirds and butterflies, and it has a fruit that songbirds love to eat. That one is one that typically disappears very quickly. So the fruits on this particular plant, so it's hard to find them sometimes. So I know we're kind of running out of time.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Or I know we didn't get a chance to look at everything in the garden, but maybe, Teresa, you can pan around and get one more look at all the beautiful plants. Is there any last minute questions?
I want to talk a little bit about the basket flower, that if you keep panning over there. We can close with the plants on this one. And there's an area of basket flower here. I did not know about basket flowers until just a few years ago. And the first time I saw them, there's some kind of a little bug in that one right there. The first time I ever saw them was down on the Mission Reach of the Riverwalk. And these flowers get to be 3 to 4 to even sometimes 5 inches across. They're just beautiful flowers. They're called basket because the bottom of them looks like a basket weave kind of thing. I don't think you can see it very well except on the buds, but they attract butterflies like crazy, bees like crazy, beetles, all kinds of insects. Really, really love them. They come up from seed, so you have to let them go to seed. They look a little raggedy while they're going to seed, but they're great. And every one of those flowers, and now I played little scientist here. I took about 6 or 7 or 8 of the flower heads that were spent last year, and I counted the number of seeds they average 150 seeds in each of those flowers. So they're trying to provide for the next year's crop. So we have just a couple of more minutes, and I guess we want to say our parting words.
Sure. The only thing I want to say is keep it as simple as possible. Don't over analyze when you're putting in a garden, regardless of what species you're trying to entice to your backyard. But remember that what you do, of course, has a huge impact on our environment. Focus on native plants, add that water component, and that is the beginning of a great wildscape and or habitat for songbirds, butterflies, hummingbirds, all kinds of wildlife. So I wish you well and hope you can plant a native plant maybe this week.
And I wanted to thank Patsy and Judith both for being here. The Master Naturalists and Texas Parks and Wildlife have been important partners in creating Phil Hardberger Park and in supporting programs here throughout the year. So we really appreciate your participation today. Again, we're with the Phil Hardberger Park Conservancy. Normally, we would have welcomed all of you here with us in the garden today. Until we can do that again, we will be moving a lot of our programming online, and we're just kind of doing that week by week. So keep checking back on our website. On our website from today's program, you can also find a list of plants, not completely comprehensive, but a lot of the plants they spoke about today. And you can provide contact information so we can get more information to you. We'll also try to answer some of the questions that came up that we didn't get to. And you also can learn about how you can become a part of the Conservancy. We're a member-based organization, a nonprofit that supports Hardberger Park, and we would love to have you be a part of us. So take care, enjoy this wonderful Saturday.
One last thing. I tried to think of what I wanted to say in conclusion, and I kept coming up with the word gratitude. I'm so delighted with this garden and with the people who have helped us and welcomed us in doing it. And as I come over here and work, the light extends to the visitors that we have. And actually, I see right now we have some folks here that are waiting to get in here so they can take graduation photos. Some things with graduation, I guess, still go on. Sadly, a lot of our seniors haven't had the normal graduation. But it's gratitude for the life that we have in here and for what we've helped to produce with a whole bunch of help. So thank you. Thank you to